Who wrote the book of Hebrews? This is a question that's puzzled Christians as well as biblical scholars for a long time, the debate stretching back around 1800 years, where we get the first indication that there was question about who wrote the letter of Hebrews. This problem presents itself because the letter of Hebrews, unlike all the other letters of the New Testament, excepting the letters of Jahn, the letters of Hebrews doesn't have the author's name at the beginning. And moreover, there is little situational evidence within the letter itself to help us determine who it was who wrote the letter. All surmises as to the authorship must therefore be drawn from an analysis of the letter itself and from listening to the determinations of Christians of the first few centuries. So, who wrote it? Who wrote the letter to the Hebrews? With no name again in the body of the letter, we must consider a few factors inherent in the text itself. First, we must consider the quality of the writing itself. It is a polished prose. It is elevated, elegant in style. Many biblical scholars regard it as the highest quality Greek of the New Testament. Whoever wrote it, therefore, had a literary mind and a strong command of the language. And the thought within the letter is clear and at the same time quite complex. It utilizes a mode of argumentation common among rabbis of the time. It utilizes Neoplatonic categories and symbolism familiar to Philo and the Alexandrian school. Philo was a prominent Jewish rabbi in Alexandria at the time, and the type of thought exhibited in Hebrews has parallels in this Alexandrian school of the first couple centuries. Thirdly, the author of Hebrews exhibits thorough knowledge of the Old Testament. He quotes the Old Testament scriptures multiple times and at length, and discusses such concepts as angels, Moses, the Levitical priesthood, the tabernacle, and the sacrificial system. Whoever wrote the letter either had first-hand knowledge of Judaic practices of the time or was extensively studied in the Old Testament scriptures. And fourthly, there are a constellation of lesser important details that have to be accounted for. The community receiving the letter seems to be one that is persecuted or otherwise in distress. Imprisonment is referred to, as is our brother Timothy, who is a close traveling companion of Paul. And there is a personal familiarity of the letter. The author speaks of being restored to the recipients of the letter, and he speaks with a personal authority, seeking not as much to persuade as to encourage and exhort, speaking as though he knows the recipients personally. And so, who fits the bill? Who could have written this letter? The most prominent of the candidates is the Apostle Paul. For most of Christian history, Paul has been regarded as the author of Hebrews, and for good reasons. Paul was a Hebrew of Hebrews. He studied under Gamaliel, who was an important Jewish teacher of the time, and he knew the Old Testament scriptures extensively. In his other writings, he quotes the Old Testament at length, drawing on characters and events depicted therein, and often interpreting them allegorically, as we see in the book of Hebrews. And in his other letters, Paul emphasizes faith, as we see too in the book of Hebrews, particularly in chapter 11, where faith is repeated multiple times. And there are also biographical features of Paul's life that accord well with the letter to the Hebrews. Paul himself was imprisoned on multiple occasions. In fact, half of his letters were written from prison. Paul traveled extensively, so it would not be unusual for him to write a letter at distance to a community in another location. And in its closing, the letter to the Hebrews mentions our brother Timothy. Paul himself wrote 5 letters with Timothy, as well as 2 additional letters to him. And it's fair to say that Timothy was Paul's protege and closest ministry companion. Furthermore, in early Christian history, most prominent theologians regarded Paul as the author of Hebrews. Cyril of Alexandria, Athanasius, Augustine, Jerome, and Gregory all thought that Paul was the author of Hebrews. And Eusebius, the great early church historian, likewise regards its author as Paul, although he acknowledges there is some debate about the matter. And Origen, who noted the style was different than Paul's other letters, believed that the thoughts of Hebrews were Paul's thoughts. And in the dozen times Origen quotes from the book of Hebrews, in each case he recognizes Paul as its author. And the earliest canonical list we have of the New Testament, the Beatty Papyrus II, lists Hebrews as among Paul's works, following the book of Romans in its list. And in official lists of New Testament books from the late 4th and early 5th centuries on, the book of Hebrews is listed among Paul's letters, and in collections of biblical books published, Hebrews is consistently combined with Paul's letters. However, the ancient Christian witness as to Paul's authorship was not unanimous. Both Tertullian and Clement of Alexandria, writing around 200 AD, thought that people other than Paul were its author. And Hebrews is not included in all ancient lists, including the important Muratorian fragment. And what are some elements within the letter itself that speak against Paul's authorship? Well, firstly, while it includes Paul's standard closing, "Grace be with you," as found in all his other letters, it does not include his standard greeting, which is found in all of his other letters. The book of Hebrews begins abruptly with, "In many and various ways God spoke of old to our fathers by the prophets, but in these last days he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed the heir of all things, through whom also he created the world." The letter, or written sermon as it were, begins right away without Paul's standard greeting. The letter also doesn't include many important thoughts that Paul discusses in his other letters, most prominently the resurrection, and it also doesn't include many common Pauline phrases, such as Christ Jesus. Furthermore, Hebrews does include some elements, such as the high priest, that doesn't make appearance in any of Paul's other letters. Importantly, in Hebrews 2:3, it seems as though the author of the letter received the message that he is communicating through the letter. It is written, "It was declared at first by the Lord, and it was attested to us by those who heard him." However, this speaks against what Paul writes elsewhere, such as in Galatians 1, where he says emphatically, "For I would have you know, brethren, that the gospel which was preached by me is not man's gospel. For I did not receive it from man, nor was I taught it, but it came through a revelation of Jesus Christ." Thus, it seems that the letter of Hebrews might have received the teachings that he's passing on, rather than receiving them directly from Christ, as Paul states in Galatians. However, speaking against this, in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul does write, "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures," and so forth. And so, 1 Corinthians 15 seems to suggest that while Paul received his principal commission and revelation directly from Christ, he also received some teachings by tradition or by relation. And so it does not necessarily exclude Paul writing what is included in Hebrews 2:3. And most importantly, the style of Hebrews is notably different from that of Paul's other letters. Paul's letters are typically rough, somewhat rushed, written ad hoc to communities addressing particular questions or addressing urgent situations. Hebrews, in contrast, is elevated, elegant, clear, and polished, much more balanced, considerate, and deliberate than Paul's other letters. And while Paul is certainly capable of elevated prose, as in Philippians 2 and 1 Corinthians 13, this general difference of style has led most modern scholars to regard Paul as not the author of Hebrews. And so, if not Paul, who else could it be? Around 200 AD, Tertullian, in his work On Modesty, credits Barnabas with writing the book of Hebrews. Barnabas was an early church leader and evangelist, and was with Paul at Antioch and Jerusalem, and joined Paul on his first missionary journey. Therefore, he would have likely known Paul's associate Timothy, and would have also known communities to whom he could write at a distance. Furthermore, Acts 4:36 describes Barnabas as a Levite, someone who would have had an extensive knowledge of the Old Testament, which we do see in the book of Hebrews. And the book of Hebrews is somewhat similar in style to another letter known as the Epistle of Barnabas from antiquity. And while since antiquity Barnabas has not been regarded as the author of the letter, his name is associated with this style of writing. Another prominent possibility is Luke. Luke, as the writer of his Gospel and the book of Acts, is evidently a very capable author. And he too was closely connected with Paul's missionary work and would likely have known Timothy. Clement of Alexandria, writing around 200 AD, suggested that Luke indeed was the author, believing that the original letter was written by Paul in Hebrew, and that the letter of Hebrews we have today was a transcription into Greek, paraphrasing Paul's thoughts in Luke's language. And a third possibility, first forwarded prominently by Martin Luther in the 16th century, was the early evangelist Apollos. In fact, the description of Apollos in Acts 18 almost serves as a job description for the author of Hebrews. Now, a Jew named Apollos, a native of Alexandria, came to Ephesus. He was an eloquent man, well versed in the Scriptures. He had been instructed in the way of the Lord, and being fervent in spirit, he spoke and taught accurately the things concerning Jesus, though he knew only the baptism of Jahn. He began to speak boldly in the synagogue. He powerfully confuted the Jews in public. showing by the Scriptures that the Christ was Jesus. Apollos also traveled in Paul's circles, is mentioned in Paul's letters, and would thereby have likely known Timothy. As a Jewish man from Alexandria steeped in the Scriptures and writing to Jewish Christians, Apollos could well have written the book of Hebrews. And in addition to these three figures, other names have also been forwarded, including Silas, Priscilla and Aquila, Clement of Rome, and others as possible authors of the letter. And while all of these suggested persons have connections or qualities that would fit the bill as the author of Hebrews, there is no positive evidence within the letter or outside the Bible that any of them did. And suggestions for all of these names are only singular in antiquity, meaning they only come from a single source, or are first suggested rather late, appearing first during the Reformation or thereafter. And so, for the difficulty of ascribing it unequivocally to Paul, as well as for the many other possible candidates, most scholars today regard the author as unknown. The author could have been any of them, or as possibly an unknown, unnamed figure from the first century of Christianity. And while this book of Hebrews is regarded in antiquity and today as part of the canon of Scripture, who the author of this great work of theology is remains uncertain. And if you've watched this far, you might be wondering to yourself, well, what does Stephen think? What do I think? Who do I think could have written the book of Hebrews? Well, I must say that going into doing research around this topic, I previously had been rather convinced that Paul was not the author. Following the opinions of the majority of scholars, I thought it was probably an unknown Christian from the first century. However, as I've evaluated the arguments and the evidence both within the letter and outside the letter, and certainly the ancient witness as to the authorship of the letter, I'm more and more persuaded that it is probably Paul, or if not directly written or dictated by Paul, one of his close associates largely translating his thoughts into writing. And I think so, not only because the ancient witness is nearly unanimous to this fact. Origen himself defends it to some degree, even though as he's the most often cited source as being uncertain as to the authorship of Hebrews. And I also see, looking closely into the letter, definite parallels of thought and continuity of thought between the book of Hebrews and Paul's other letters. And the major objection, the major critique of Pauline authorship is that of style. That the style of Hebrews is definitely different. It is notably different. It feels and sounds different from most of Paul's letters, with the exception that the last chapter, chapter 13, in his moral exhortations, as well as in his kind of closing greetings and blessing and so forth, that all suddenly has a feel that is a lot more similar to what we find in Paul's other letters. And I'm a little bit skeptical, a little bit hesitant myself of criticizing something on stylistic grounds alone. While I am definitely not a scholar relating to style and language myself, there have been a couple instances in my life where style has played kind of a curious role that has stuck with me. Firstly, I lived for about 10 years working in entertainment itself, and the art of acting, as well as the music and other types of performing, is of translating one's own personality, presence, and thought and speaking to another way, to suit a role. And people become very good at this, and this is a very common thing for especially actors to do. Paul himself writes notably in 1 Corinthians 9, he writes of himself that he says, "For though I am free from all men, I have made myself a slave to all that I might win the more. To the Jews I became as a Jew in order to win Jews. To those under the law I became as one under the law, though not myself being under the law, that I may win those under the law. To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all men, that I might by all means save some." And so in a world that Paul is traveling in, which was much more varied than we experience today in our day-to-day lives, Paul traveling around the ancient world, these different cultures, these different communities, may very well, in accordance with his own writing, adapted himself to some degree to communicate best with his recipients. I notice this myself very much if I'm speaking in evangelical circles or with Catholics or with mainline Protestants or people within particular traditions. I certainly will adapt my emphases or my phrasing, my way of speaking and so forth to better connect with those whom I'm interacting with. This is all again to demonstrate my own uneasiness, my hesitation with evaluating and determining things solely on stylistic grounds. And so, in summary, while most modern scholars today regard the author of Hebrews as probably unknown and possibly as one of the figures mentioned above, though likely not Paul, I myself, in the study for this video, have come to a stronger position that I think it is probably actually Paul, or someone closely connected to Paul, translating or paraphrasing his thoughts. And, well, you may join the many who don't know exactly who wrote the book of Hebrews. At least we all know who brewed the coffee.